Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on the last Sherlock Holmes story by Michael Dibdin, which I absolutely loved rereading this month. This is Sherlock Holmes chasing down, facing off against Jack the Ripper. And I'll put some spoilers in at the end, but this was utterly compelling on this reread. I found it to be so much more interesting, so much more haunting. To really interrogate the reader in fascinating ways, ways that I just completely missed or did not sense the first time I read this more than a decade ago. And in the intervening years, I have reread numerous times the Sherlock Holmes novels and stories by Arthur Conan Doyle. I have read a number of Dibdin's Aurelio Zen detective novels. And I didn't really enjoy this book the first time I read it, but there was something about it that made me loop back and want to engage with this text again. And I'm glad I did, because the world that Dibdin gives us is so carefully realized. It's a pastiche, it's an homage to Arthur Conan Doyle, but it's also grittier and grimier. It's getting underneath the fingernails of Victorian society and examining aspects of it that we as readers don't necessarily pay attention to in the Arthur Conan Doyle works. It is also a book that really asks questions. It asks questions about, what do we find so compelling about Sherlock Holmes? What are the aspects of his character that we're drawn to, that we find heroic or clever or fascinating? And the Watson who's writing this novel is feeling those same questions and experiencing those same questions as they confront something else that we were asked to interrogate: the true horror of the 5 women that we know of murdered horrifically in Whitechapel in 1888. Watson and Holmes confront this, and through that, Dibdin allows the reader to be interrogated about, what do we find so fascinating and interesting about this unknown murderer who slaughtered these women? What is it that we find so compelling about femicide? And other writers have done that with incredible effect in the intervening years, but I think this is a book that is really getting at that in subtle ways. So I find the book to be very controversial. I know far more people who loathe this novel than love it. Again, no spoilers yet. But I found it to be interesting. I think particularly the way that Dibdin characterizes addiction and mental illness during the Victorian era is something I just totally missed the first time I encountered it. The way that Dibdin has woven threads of the Arthur Conan Doyle Holmes into these pages and then carried them into this Borgesian sideways perspective, where we're asked to consider what's going on within the story and how we feel about that. So I want to give just a couple of things, sense of it. The book is picking up after the Sign of Four and midway through sort of the mysteries that have been commemorated by Arthur Conan Doyle in the adventures and the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes originally set up as a consulting detective in 1877, some four years before I met him. Cases were at first hard to come by, but at that time each presented a fresh challenge and was tackled with enthusiasm. 10 years later, the position was very different. Like all superior intellects, Holmes disdained to cover the same ground twice, and thus a point was bound to come when he spent less time solving crimes than he did lying about our front room, bemoaning the dullness and lack of enterprise of the British criminal class. At such moments, he frequently put me in mind of a jaded emperor from the last days of Rome, berating his underlings for their inability to create a spectacle lavish or rare enough to divert him. It was at about this time that he began to resort to cocaine. At first, the drug was nothing more than an occasional expedient to which Holmes had recourse when every other weapon for staving off ennui had failed him. I regarded it as a filthy habit, but still preferable to the alternative: unpredictable and savage outbursts of nervous energy in which he would assault the furniture with a horsewhip, or in some less desirable way relieve the pent-up frustration of his soul. I vividly recall the occasion when he sat himself down with a revolver and a box of cartridges and began firing at the opposite wall until he had improved its appearance with the script VR and crown executed in bullet pucks. Holmes was a man very finely balanced between reason and hysteria. He liked to compare himself to a racing engine which will tear itself to pieces unless coupled to the work that it was designed to do. In the absence of such work, the cocaine seemed to act as a regulator, and as such I was prepared to turn a blind eye to his use of it. It seemed at first an acceptable remedy for Holmes's chronic ailment. And the way that Watson is is telling this story and introducing this aspect of Holmes. This is something that we saw in The Sign of Four. That's how the book opens, is with Sherlock Holmes using cocaine and Watson sort of feeling very uncomfortable about it. And there's something about Dibdin capturing sort of those seedy, grimy aspects of Holmes. Who is this guy when he's not sitting there showing off his intellect and, dazzling the reader with his brilliant mind? How does he stave off boredom? Certainly, being a child in the 1990s, there were many ways to stave off boredom. But Dibdin is capturing something there. He's allowing us to ask questions that we perhaps have not thought about. At another point, Dibdin gives us Holmes dazzling Watson with his ability to draw all of these conclusions. How do you know we went to Simpson's? Holmes smiled indulgently. From your boots and from that same regularity of character to which I have already alluded. My dear fellow, capriciousness is simply not one of your vices. You have but one newspaper, one club, one political party, one tobacco, and one tailor. Should you need to resort to a restaurant, you have but one, and it is Simpson's. My conviction on this point is merely corroborated by the unmistakable traces on your boots of an interesting argillaceous loam, large quantities of which are at present inconveniencing pedestrians in the Strand due to the roadworks. Very well, Holmes, but the wine? You mean to tell me that you can tell one variety from another by studying the stain? I have no doubt whatever that it would be possible, but I have not undertaken any research on the subject. The British criminal is not enough of a wine bibber for it to pay dividends, but it would be folly to order anything but beef at Simpson's, and I happen to know that your gastronomical rule of thumb is beef on the bone, bone with the beef. Amazing, I muttered, and wonderful, but I was actually trembling with relief. I had indeed dined out the previous evening, but not with Stamford. My companion had been Mary Morstan. Our engagement was proving rather trying. Quite apart from various tedious financial questions on which I need not dwell, I was practically speaking in the position of a man maintaining two households. And the way that we see Holmes's displeasure at Watson's relationship and ultimately engagement with Mary Morstan is something that pervades these pages, and the fact that Watson notes, having recounted one of Holmes's rare blunders, I should add that this sort of exercise was to him no more than a form of parlor game. He was perfectly aware of the weakness of unsupported inference, and in any question of importance, he used it merely as one weapon in his formidable intellectual armory. And so we get to see these aspects of the Holmes from Arthur Conan Doyle striving and succeeding or failing, and how Watson views that, how he views Sherlock Holmes as far more complex than what we have just been gifted in the adventures and the memoirs and in the novels and in the casebook and such. And so he draws on so many different aspects. At one point, this is where there will be a minor spoiler, Holmes becomes convinced that Jack the Ripper is none other than Professor Moriarty. And this serves as the introduction of Professor Moriarty to Watson. Watson has never encountered this character before. And there's a way in which, Holmes notes this empty house across the street, recalling, of course, the adventure that opens up the return of Sherlock Holmes. And so the way that Dibdin has carefully read the books and stories to create this is, I think, very loving, but also drawing a very specific point of view. And throughout the book, as Watson learns more about the case and as he sees Holmes really struggling to stop Jack the Ripper, he starts to view his friend in different lights. And one of the things he questions, this is where I think he really does question the reader, Dibdin, is what is the nature of Sherlock Holmes as a consulting detective? Who is this guy, and what seems to animate him? Is he a champion of the law? Holmes was, above all, a great champion of the law, the great champion. Previously, this had always seemed self-evident. Holmes had devoted his life to bringing criminals to justice. To question whether he was a champion of the law seemed on the face of it as absurd as to inquire whether the Archbishop of Canterbury was a Christian. It was, of course, true that on more than one occasion, having discovered the guilty party, he had summarily appointed himself judge and jury and allowed a murderer to die in freedom or a thief to flee the country. But these were only trivial infractions, one might even say liberal interpretations of the great rule. The rule itself still obtained, or did it? As I thought about it, I came to see that for a champion of the law, Holmes' manner of going about his work was, to say the least, eccentric. When it was a question of accepting or rejecting a case, did he listen to his supplicant's tale of woe with the feeling that a wrong had been done which it was his duty to put right? Hardly. Moral fervor was a luxury. Holmes allowed himself only after having ascertained that the problem represented the necessary features of interest. That was the criterion by which all pleas were judged, and if the case did not interest him, he would have nothing to do with it. And so there is this question in there about, what is going on, like what is it that animates the detective that so many of us as readers have loved. And Watson is viewing, this creation of his in these stories and memoirs with this suddenly different perspective. It's holding up a mirror, and not just to Watson, the narrator, but to we, the reader. And so there's something just I find haunting about a book that is able to make us really examine and demand these questions, even when we can't answer them. And so I really just appreciated how I was able to engage with the book this time. Honestly, I enjoyed this more than all, or perhaps all but one, of the Aurelio Zen novels. And I was really surprised. I thought, okay, I'm going to reread this, and then I'm basically going to, trade it in because we're clearing out some space in here. But there was something that really worked this time. And so I want to kind of go into some books I was reminded of, and then maybe at the very end I'll put in a little bit on some spoilers for those who have read the book. So as I mentioned, Sherlock Holmes is the crucial character within it. And if you're a fan, the best editions you can get are the new annotated editions, in my mind, where Leslie Klinger and others have drawn on just the enormous corpus of Sherlock Holmes pastiches, fiction, essays, scholarship, such that it is over the years, and create these intense notes throughout all of the different works. And so the novels, this book makes me want to reread The Sign of Four, a work that I never really thought I would want to reread. The Hound of the Baskervilles, though, is great. But the Sherlock Holmes New Annotated Edition, and certainly from the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and the Memoirs, the Cardboard Box, a mystery that's rarely read, but that I think also is probably one of the more violent Sherlock Holmes stories, becomes very crucial. Certainly The Final Problem, as we see how Arthur Conan Doyle, resolves the Holmes versus Moriarty. The middle edition includes The Return, His Last Bow, and the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, but these are excellent. Certainly, there have been other attempts to explore the Jack the Ripper crimes. Alan Moore's From Hell, illustrated by Eddie Campbell, is one of the great ones. In Unsparing Look, again, this is one that again tells us just as much about Victorian society as it does anything about a mystery. Iain Sinclair with Whitechapel's Scarlet Tracings, which I have not read, but I'm hoping to get to very soon. I was inspired by Jason Harrigan from the Aesthetic Ascetic or Byways in Bookland to get this a couple of years ago, and I'm looking forward to actually getting into it finally. Hawksmoor by Peter Ackroyd, kind of delves into that world a little bit. The great short story Sagittarius by Ray Russell, collected in Haunted Castles, which I reread as well, and I'll probably do a video on that separately to kind of pair with my video on Sardonicus by Ray Russell, but Sagittarius is a marvel. Lyndsay Faye did her take of Sherlock Holmes going up against Jack the Ripper with Dust and Shadow, which I'm looking forward to getting into. John Gardner, who has written a number of different books, not the John Gardner of Grendel, but the John Gardner who wrote like License Renewed and some later Sherlock Holmes books. He wrote a number of Moriarty books. So The Return of Moriarty, The Revenge of Moriarty, which includes him trying to ruin Holmes by cutting off his cocaine supply. So there's something about the 1970s, 1960s? Yeah, 1970s, about the crime fiction tending in that direction. Another book that I think captures an element of the horror that really lies at the heart of the Whitechapel murders is 1977 by David Peace, and this deals with the Yorkshire Ripper and the horror of women, and youths being attacked in the 1970s and early 1980s in northern England. This, I think, is an absolute masterpiece, but again, one that is very graphic, very violent. Michael Dibdin, I would say my two favorite Zen novels are Cabal and then Dead Lagoon, set in Venice. There's something about how Dibdin is able to capture interesting settings really well, even when the mysteries and the secondary characters aren't necessarily drawn quite as sharply as I might expect them to be. Certainly a book that deals with crime and the murders of women, and how trying to force a reader to grapple with what that means to be a part of a society that allows this type of violence to exist, is 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. And then, as I had mentioned with Borges, stories like Death in the Compass or even The Garden of Forking Paths really, I think, showcase that sideways perspective on crime. And then finally, another novel from, I believe, the 1970s. I think this is the 1970s as well. Yeah. The Tears of Autumn by Charles McCarry. And this gives his view of the John F. Kennedy assassination that is almost certainly false, but it is also true in this sense of it's like this secret history that makes as much sense as what the truth does, or probably makes more sense than what the truth does. That's not the type of conspiracy or plot that we've been inundated with over the past 30 years. It's a very different type of plot and conspiracy, and yet it feels just as authentic and true in the way that I think the last Sherlock Holmes story does. The solution presented here doesn't feel true, because Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty are fake, and there were 5 women murdered by Jack the Ripper, at least. But the solution here does feel true to itself, I think. And so now for the massive spoilers. Massive spoilers. Stop watching if you have not read this. And please be careful in the comments, because there might be more spoilers in the comments. I think there's a reason a lot of people dislike this book, and it's because of who the bad guy is. And I think I disliked it at the time when I read it in my mid-20s, and I thought, like, no, you can't do that. And rereading it this time with the open mind, like when you exclude all else, it makes sense that this could, it's obviously a wrong solution because Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty are fake. But this sense of the solution, I think, is authentic. It's real. And it pushes those questions even more at the reader of like, okay, you were so interested in this. You were excited to read this and see the weird mystery. And now you're faced with it. How do you feel? How does Watson feel? There's something real there. And even reading it now, some 50 years after it was published nearly, the way that Watson just has almost total disregard for the women who are being murdered. And it's like, that's awful and horrifying. But also, most of those women weren't going to have, a healthy, happy life for the rest of their days. So it's kind of just chalk it up to the unfortunates of society. There's something horrifyingly dismissive, even at someone who is horrified by the crimes. And so I think the book is working on a level that maybe Dibdin never anticipated, but is thoroughly compelling. So let me know if you've read these or others, if you have a favorite Sherlock Holmes pastiche. And as always, I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.